We're continuing on part 2, Web of Conspiracy. The dominoes fall. The evidence is so overwhelming that only an idiot could ignore it, deny it, and leave it. David Berkowitz. It's as if each time there's a weak link found, someone is there to eliminate it. District Attorney John Santucci. He said, "Drink the blood. We always drink the blood in the cult." Death Mask Killer Bernard Lagueros. Satanism is a byproduct. The real motivation for the leaders is drugs. Vinny, a prisoner source. Chapter 12. Hello from the gutters. At 6 p.m. on Wednesday, October 25th, I hurried through LA LaGuardia Airport to board an Empire Airlines commuter flight. The destination was Utica, and David Berkowitz, who was being held outside the city at Central New York Psychiatric Center in Marcy. The maximum security facility was a temporary stop for the son of Sam, who would soon be transferred to a cell block in Attica. After a short and scenic flight at low altitude, the small jet touched down at about 7:15 and nosed its way to Utica's generic passenger terminal. The Horizon Motel was adjacent to the airport, and as I registered, I was greeted by a clerk who said several people were trying to contact me. I knew Felix Gilroy had driven up earlier with the court reporter Lorianne Wyatkowski, so I expected a message from him, but there were also notes from Jim, who'd called to wish us luck, and from a reporter named Joe Kelly, who worked for a Utica newspaper. Kelly, it developed, had read an Associated Press story about the interview and wanted to talk to us. He would write 2 articles about our visit. I found him in the motel bar with Gilroy, where we discussed the case for an hour over cocktails. Watkowski, who was in her 30s, later joined Gilroy and me for dinner. During the meal, the mood was markedly tense in anticipation of the next day's interrogation. Gilroy, trying to lift our collective spirits, teased a nervous Lorraine by suggesting she might be enamored of Berkowitz. Parodying the supermarket tabloids, he bit down on the cigar and said, "You can even write an article about it. You can call it I Fried Eggs for Son of Sam, Bride of Berkowitz." Lorraine, who was worried about the prospect of being in the same room with Berkowitz, groaned audibly, and no amount of friendly cajoling eased her tension. Later in Gilroy's room, he and I ran through a series of questions that I composed for Berkowitz, queries concerning John and Michael Carr, the Son of Sam letters, Fred Cowan, the Moskowitz murder, and the cult clues. Gilroy had devised his own list, which centered on Berkowitz's relationship Herb Clark, the guard who slipped him the conspiracy questions and took the Sam Sleeps photo that resulted in Midigar's indictment. At about 1 a.m., Gilroy wearily looked up from the pile of papers. "We're as ready as we'll ever be. I'll be dreaming about German shepherds," and he said, and we called it a night. I, too, had trouble sleeping outside. A steady rain fell, and a thick fog rolled in. Beyond the window, the blinking lights of the airport haloed in the mist. Everything was morose. I thought about the past 14 months and how I'd gone from outside the case to the verge of becoming the first non-official person to have access to Berkowitz. So many times we'd danced on the brink of failure, and now, almost miraculously, I was a few hours away from confronting the man whose life and crimes had so dominated my own existence for more than a year. It was a singular occasion, one I knew would strongly affect my future. It was a long and nervous night. As I tossed fitfully, I began to dread the possibility that despite all I'd learned, I was wrong and Berkowitz would pointedly deny everything. It wasn't a comforting thought. At 9:15 a.m., after a quick breakfast, we drove about 5 miles through a drizzling rain to Marcy. The wipers scraped noisily across the windshield, puncturing the silence that pervaded the car. The preparations and background work were done. The strategy was set. There was nothing left to say. As we drove up the hill to the center, Marcy loomed ominous and forbidding. Its starkness was overpowering. At the guardhouse, we were joined by Special Prosecutor's Assistant Tom McCloskey and Investigator David Campbell. McCloskey was handling the Midigar case for the state, and he and Campbell made the journey from New York City to observe the questioning. Ironically, McCloskey was formerly an assistant district attorney in Queens and was assigned titular responsibility for the Virginia Volkerichin case before the arrest of Berkowitz. He and I weren't formally introduced, and it would be months before he learned who I really was. Gilroy merely said I was his assistant, which was true. Once inside the gates, we passed through several checkpoints and were ushered into a waiting room before George Daly. Head of security led us down a corridor and a flight of stairs. We finally entered a small conference room known as the courtroom. In the center was a large wooden table with 6 chairs placed around it. Lorraine Wachowski was noticeably on edge, and Gilroy, making conversation, asked where she wanted to sit. I'll know better when I see it. I'll know better when I see where Mr. Berkowitz will be seated, she replied. Felix looked at her strangely. What did you say? He asked. Wachowski repeated her statement, nudging her. I gestured over to her shoulder, and she turned around and froze. Berkowitz was already in the room, sitting at a table and smiling at her like she was crazy. He walked in right behind us, unescorted and free of any handcuffs or restraint. Oh, I see you're already here, Lorraine stammered, and Berkowitz grinned at her. Berkowitz was now 25, about 5'11", and powerfully built. He was wearing scuffed black shoes, green prison trousers, and a short-sleeved green shirt. He had a one-day beard. His eyes were bright, blue, and very alert. His dark hair was short and curly, and he'd allowed his sideburns to grow long and thick. He appeared relaxed, leaning back in his chair while waiting for us to begin. On the record, all the questioning would be done by Gilroy, and I sat next to the attorney, prepared to pass comments or follow-up questions as the need arose. We were directly opposite Berkowitz. The others took the remaining seats in the room, moving their chairs away from us. Security Chief Daly occupied the seat by the door, and so it began. Gilroy opened with a series of questions who established that Berkowitz knew and remembered Herb Clark, and that he indeed answered queries Clark put to him about the Son of Sam case. Berkowitz stated he answered those questions truthfully. Gilroy then asked, Do you know a person named John Carr? Yes. How did you know John Carr? I don't want to talk about it. This was a major confirmation of my suspicions, and I swallowed hard at the disclosure. Gilroy began pressing, and Berkowitz began step-siding. Finally, Felix asked, Are you intentionally not answering my questions? Yes. When did you meet John Carr for the first time? I don't remember. When did you meet Michael Carr for the first time? I don't remember. You remember now that you have met them? Yes. You don't remember when, is that correct? Yes. What is your present attitude? Do you think you will ever get out of jail? No. Do you think if you gave me the answers to these questions that other people might end up in jail? There is a good possibility, and I wouldn't want that to happen. You are protecting somebody then, is that what you are trying to tell me? I don't know, but I don't want to see anyone else in jail. With this exchange, my pulse quickened. It was a significant admission from Berkowitz, but then he refused to answer a series of follow-up questions, telling Gilroy that while he didn't want Midgard to go to prison either, he wouldn't provide any assistance. Gilroy then asked about the word association clues in the Son of Sam Breslin letter. This is another Q&A deal. I'm not going to read the Q&A. I'm just going to read it, and it starts in succession, question and answer. Beginning with question. In some of these letters, is there a code? In some of these letters, there is a code, isn't there? A clever code? I'd rather not talk about the letters. It would be very important to me if you could at least confirm the fact that there is a code in these letters without going into details. I wouldn't call it a code. What would you call it? I don't know. Doesn't the letter that talks about the Wicked King Wicker and the pine box and all, isn't that sort of a couple of clues to where you were living at the time? Yes. You put that in there intentionally, didn't you? Yes. Did you have any books to follow, or did you read anything in preparation of the code that was in the letter? No. Did you completely make it up on your own? I'd rather not say. When you used the term knock on coffins, that was a reference to Pine Street, wasn't it? It could have been. Did you use word substitution in your hints? I guess so. What can you tell me about the conversation with Clark about the hints you put in that letter? Nothing. You are going to make me ask all the questions about it, is that right? I'm not going to talk about the letters. Could you talk about the code or hints if it's not too much trouble? Would that really upset you? Yes, it would upset me. Gilroy then told Berkowitz that if he refused to cooperate or was intentionally deceptive, he could be ordered by the court to testify as a witness. Berkowitz then agreed to be somewhat more forthcoming. He stated that Clark talked to him numerous times about the clues in the letter, about John Carr and other subjects, and that he answered Clark truthfully. Gilroy then sought to learn what the authorities had done regarding possible accomplices. Back to the question and answer. Did any of the psychiatrists ever ask you if other people were involved in these crimes? No. Did anybody ever ask you if other people were involved? I don't think so. Didn't Herb Clark ask you those questions? I don't remember the exact question he asked me, but they were about the shootings. If you were to tell all you know about this, there would be other dangerous people who would get into trouble. Isn't that so? They might get into trouble. I don't know. Do you care about society at large? Well, my world is in here. Berkowitz then said that he knew German Shepherd dogs were being killed around Pine Street, and that he did not phone Mrs. Florence Larson to inquire about adopting a German Shepherd 2 days before his arrest. He then evaded another series of questions to which Gilroy responded. I have all day to stay here. I can stay here all day, Berkowitz glared at him. I don't feel like staying here all day, he said. At that point, we recessed for 10 minutes. While the others went for coffee, I stayed in the room with Berkowitz, walking around to his side of the table and taking the seat next to his. I wasn't expecting these kinds of questions, he said. Did you have a part in this? Yes. The cops never went into any of this with you, did they? No. And I'll bet you're glad they didn't, Berkowitz smiled. It's for the good, I added. Even yours, though it might not look that way. There's not much that can be for my good, he replied, knowing that he was a sports fan. Then I switched to the subject of baseball. He relaxed, and for a few minutes we amiably discussed the recent Yankees-Dodgers World Series, which he'd seen on television. I was amazed at Berkowitz's attitude, his willingness to chat about sports as if we were two people who'd just met and were having a beer together in a neighborhood tavern. He was alert. intelligent, and clear as a bell. Being in his presence, I was convinced by the demon dog story he told the police was every bit the fabrication I'd always believed it to be. Back in the room, Gilroy began by again trying to get to the heart of the matter. Back to question and answers. How many people are you protecting by not disclosing everything? I don't know. Would it be fair to say it is at least 8 or 10 people? Well, I don't know. Can you give me an approximate number? I think it's in the hundreds. Did you meet all these people, or did they just operate among themselves? I'd rather not say. At this point, we didn't know what Berkowitz was alluding to, but in time, the implication would become apparent. Gilroy then asked about the Son of Sam graphic symbol, which Larry Siegel and I connected to 19th century occultist Eliphas Levi. The shooting which followed the use of the symbol in the Breslin letter occurred outside the Eliphas discotheque in Queens. Berkowitz acknowledged the symbol had significance. He added, I believe somebody put it in my mind to write that. Gilroy then brought up Berkowitz's trip to Houston, Texas in June 1976, where his Army buddy Billy Dan Parker purchased a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver for him. Berkowitz said Parker had no idea of the weapon's intended purpose. Back to question and answers. You visited John Carr's former wife in Houston, didn't you? No. You are smiling now. Does that mean you are kind of not telling the truth? No, I am telling the truth. What makes you smile? Are you hiding something, right? You don't want to be completely honest with me, isn't that so? I'd rather not talk about it. Gilroy then moved to the reason he asked Berkowitz about Carr's former wife, whom we never believed was visited by Berkowitz in her Beaumont home near Houston. Back to question and answers. Isn't it really true, though, that you knew John Carr's wife lived in Houston? Oh, yeah. Can you tell us why you went to Houston? I'd rather not talk about it. Is this for the same reason that other people may get into trouble? Yes. If you thought these other people were out hurting society at large, you would care about it, though, wouldn't you? Well, I don't think too much can be done about the situation now. Is it completely out of control? Yes. Why do you say that? Well, it's hard to explain. I really don't want to get into it. Do you know if John Carr was ever in Houston? He might have been. Do you recall when he came home from Dakota? I understand he died in Dakota. How did you find that out? Somebody told me. Do you know how he died? I believe he shot himself in the head. Do you know why he did that? I might. Would you have an idea why he might have done it? You are smiling now. All right, I am smiling, but I don't know why he shot himself in the head. Is there any chance these other people might be hurting people like you did? There is a possibility. Do you feel any moral obligation to tell the authorities about that possibility? They are not going to do anything. They are absolutely powerless. Why are they powerless now? They can't do it. I'd rather not talk about it. Frustrated, Gilroy turned back to the Pine Street neighborhood. Back to question and answers. When you were living there, people were killing dogs and putting them on the aqueduct. Yes. Did you know who was killing the dogs then? I had an idea. Would it mean anything to you if I told you they were still killing dogs in that area? I'm not surprised. You have some idea who was killing the dogs. Is that it? Yes. Would it be possible that the same people who are killing the dogs could also kill people? It is possible. Would you help the authorities to stop that if it was going on? There is nothing I can do. Why do you say that? It is over. Gilroy then probed the letters Berkowitz sent to Sam Carr complaining about his dog's barking, get well card to his former landlord in New Rochelle, Jack Casada, which contained Sam Carr's return address, and threatening letter to volunteer sheriff's deputy Craig Glassman, which I just learned contained Casada's return address. With these notes and return addresses, Berkowitz was circling himself as the writer of the letters and a suspect in wounding of Carr's dog and other violent incidents in the Pine Street area. Gilroy asked Berkowitz why he had given clues to his identity. "Well, I wanted the police to come find me," Berkowitz replied. Indeed, he did. As detailed earlier, he hoped he would be arrested for these relatively minor crimes and off the streets in the event the cult decried, as was discussed, to offer the police a scapegoat for the Son of Sam shootings. Berkowitz didn't want it to be him. Back to question and answers. How did you come to live at 35 Pine? It's a long story. I'm not going to get into it. Who is the wicked King Wicker? I'd rather not say. Are you the wicked King Wicker? No. Is that actually a person? I'd rather not say. Did you ever hear of kids finding dogs in plastic bags? Yes, I did hear something about it. Do you remember before you were arrested that there were a lot of dogs killed in Westchester County? Yes, I think so. Do you have any idea what that was all about? I have some idea. I'd rather not say. For the same reason you have been giving all along, it would hurt people you know? Yes, I guess you could say that. Did you ever like Sam Carr? No. Did you ever like his son John Carr? No. I hated every one of them. I hated their guts. What was the reason of that? I'd rather not say. Who was John Wheaties? I'd rather not say. Isn't it true that John Wheaties is John Carr? It's a strong possibility. You deliberately used his name in a letter, didn't you? Yes. Did you do that to kind of point the finger of suspicion at him, or at least cause him trouble or harm? Yes. Would you have liked to see the Carrs, John and Michael, get falsely accused of committing some crimes? No. You just wanted the finger of suspicion to point at them? No, I wanted them dead. But you used John Carr's name in the letter, is that right? Yes. Did you have a code name for Michael Carr? I'd rather not say. Herb Clark asked you about John Carr, didn't he? Yes. Did you give him an answer? Can you tell me what that was? No. Is that because you don't want to? Berkowitz had turned pale and nearly collapsed when Clark slipped him a note saying it was known he was involved with John Carr. That's right. Parts of your letter to Breslin refer to Black Mass. Do you know what that is? I have heard of it before. Gilroy then tried to zero on the printing style used in the Breslin letter, a style completely different from Berkowitz's own. Back to question and answers. Do you know what an illustration studio is? It is where you take pictures. Were you ever in one? I believe the Carrs have one. How did you know that? I just did. Did you ever see any of the Carrs do any illustration work? Well, I know they used to take pictures. They had a studio. Do you know where the studio was? I believe it was in their house. Did they have a sign in front of the house, Carr's Illustration Studio? No, there wasn't. Was the illustration studio listed in the phone book? A Carr 3 studio was listed in the 1976 phone directory, but not in the 1977. The listing did not say it was an illustration studio. Answer: I don't know. How did you discover it was an illustration studio? I'd rather not say. Did you know that Sam Carr had a heart condition? Yes. Berkowitz then became evasive again and stated he was alone in the killings and denied his earlier responses. We put little credence in his denials as he fidgeted, eyes darting nervously as he claimed sole responsibility. I have a very ulterior motive. I represent my client. My client was indicted because he had been involved with Herbert Clark, and Clark was asking information of you. The reason he was asking that information was because he believed you were not the only person involved in this. From the answers you have given this morning, it seems that there were other people involved in the case besides you. If you are going to stop at this point, I am going to come away with the impression that there are other people involved in this case. I can't answer any more questions. Gilroy then ascertained that Berkowitz didn't have a physical or mental reason for refusing to talk. Then he asked, "Did anybody talk to you or say anything to you? I have spoken to some people. Was it a result of the conversations you had with people that you are now expressing a desire not to confer anymore?" "Yes." "Would you identify those people?" "No." Did you talk to your psychiatrist between this morning and this afternoon?" "I don't wish to talk about it." "Can you give me a reason why you don't want to discuss it with me?" "Some people I have spoken with gave me the idea that you may have some sinister motives to this." "What could that sinister motive be?" "Perhaps you are trying to write a book or make a movie or something." "Do you know that this interview was court-ordered?" "Yes." Gilroy then repeated the legal grounds for the interrogation, and Berkowitz replied by stating that he was alone in committing the crimes and that he lied during the morning session. "I don't want any books written about me," he concluded. Back to question and answers. When you were talking to Mr. Clark, did you know that there was somebody else involved besides just Mr. Clark? "He said there were some writers, a former policeman or something like that." "Did he mention more than one person?" At this I gave Felix a sideways glance. Yes, I think there were two. I don't remember their names. There is no reason for you to feel hostility toward the fact that we had to interview you today? No. There is no reason for you to feel that we are out taking advantage of you, is there? I believe there is. Because of that feeling, have you deliberately not answered certain questions? Yes. Would you say you are evasive about answering those questions? Yes. Do you know what the word evasive means? Trying to avoid. Intentionally trying to avoid? Yes. Gilroy then told Berkowitz that his refusal to answer left us with a strong impression that he was part of a conspiracy. I will give you an example. For instance, the question about whether or not somebody called the Alifas Disco and detoured the cops away that night, whether you did that or somebody else did that. If you could answer that question for me, we would know. That would be one example. Can you answer that question? It wasn't me, Berkowitz said. Suddenly Berkowitz was talking again. I bit my lip and exhaled. Back to question and answers. You have told us you know John Carr, and John Carr, in fact, fit the description of some of the people composite sketches before you were arrested. Isn't that so? Yes, it appears that way. It doesn't really matter. He's dead now, isn't he? Would you describe him as a friend? No. Would you describe him as an enemy? Yes. How did he become your enemy? It's a long story, and I don't want to get into it. But there is no doubt in your mind, as you speak today for this record, that the John Carr that was referred to in the letters was an enemy of yours. Yes, it is my understanding that John Carr was not in New York. He was in North Dakota. How did you come to hate a man who was in Dakota? It's a long story. I don't want to get into it. Gilroy then tried to establish the circumstances under which Berkowitz and John Carr initially met. Berkowitz said the answer was nobody's business. He then stated that Midigar and I shouldn't have gotten involved in his case in the first place. Everything should have been left to the police Everything should have been left to the police officers? That's right. Do you think you got apprehended because of the ticket that was placed on your car in Brooklyn? Well, there were other reasons. It wasn't just the ticket. You knew that Sam Carr had gone to Queens to the task force to turn you in, didn't you? Yes. Did you think that the fact Sam Carr went to turn you in would cause the police to come and catch you sooner than they did? Yes. This was another major admission. Berkowitz was saying that before his arrest, he knew that Sam Carr had turned him in as son of Sam's suspect. How did you know that Michael Carr had camera equipment and the illustration studio? Just a guess. A pretty accurate guess, wouldn't you say? Yes. You are smiling now, aren't you? When you meet Michael Carr for the first time. When did you meet Michael Carr for the first time? I don't remember. Was he a nice fellow? No. Can you distinguish between a person who is, as you would say Michael Carr is, not a nice fellow and an ordinary person? I'd say anybody who worships the devil is not a nice person. This answer stunned Gilroy and me, who were not expecting it. It came from out of nowhere. Are you telling me that Michael Carr worshipped the devil? I believe he did. I believe John Carr did. What was the basis of that belief? I'd rather not say. Gilroy then asked Berkowitz if he possibly was imagining that the Carr brothers worshipped the devil. Berkowitz said, I am well. You recognize there is a fact going on in this room, the fact that we are sitting here asking you questions. That is a fact, right? There is nothing illusionary about that, is there? No. So you have a definite and concrete reason when you say the Carrs, Michael and John, worship the devil. I don't want to talk about it. Gilroy then went through a series of questions trying to ascertain the reasons for Berkowitz's hatred of the Carrs. Berkowitz said they made a lot of noise. As Gilroy pressed on, Berkowitz began to fidget. Suddenly he broke down and began to sob quietly. There was emotion in him, real emotion, and the knowledge affected me. Despite what he'd done or been involved with, I felt empathy for him. It was now apparent he was struggling with his own mind over the subjects we'd covered during the day. It was also apparent his feelings about the Carrs ran deep and were intense after a few minutes. George Dealey handed him a handkerchief. The moment was poignant and telling. Berkowitz then softly said, You can go on. Felix looked at me. You really felt for him. I could see it in your eyes. He said later. It got to me too, Felix began again slowly, and Berkowitz repeated his comments about the noise made by the Carrs that didn't satisfy Gilroy. What would lead you to believe John and Michael worshipped the devil? I had my reasons. Felix then broached the subject of the Moskowitz Violante shooting. Berkowitz said that he'd taken the ticket off his car before the shooting, that he'd seen the police write the ticket, that he was wearing a short-sleeved shirt with a jacket on over it, but that he did the shooting himself. Gilroy returned to Berkowitz's life in the Pine Street area and asked him again if he called to adopt the German Shepherd just before his arrest. At that moment the session was abruptly halted as two men entered the room. Gentlemen, my name is Richard Freshour. I am with the Attorney General's office. I would like to see the order under which you are authorized to be here. I think we mailed a copy, Felix said. I did not see it. Here is the certified copy, Felix said. Freshour wasn't placated. He introduced Dr. Daniel Ewa, Deputy Director of Clinical Staff, and said, Based on what I have before me here, I am inclined to refuse to allow the interview of Mr. Berkowitz to continue in the absence of his counsel being present. I don't know what authority you have for that, Gilroy retorted. On the authority that this is a state institution and that I am counsel for the institution. That is no authority, Felix snapped. Freshour answered, It is the authority to the extent that Mr. Berkowitz does have an attorney, I believe. He has been noticed, Felix cut in. He was sent a copy of the order. I personally spoke to his office before the court signaled it and advised him the court intended to sign an order on a certain day. This is an assistant from the special prosecutor's office. Felix said, indicating Tom McCloskey. He was noticed. There is a copy and affidavit on file of service on all these people. They were contacted. Fresh Hour then attempted to confiscate all the material gleaned from Berkowitz. I am inclined to refuse to allow the interview with Mr. Berkowitz to continue. Additionally, any material which has been obtained up until this time, I am going to request that it be retained here until we obtain. No, Felix fumed. I won't permit that. I don't think you have any authorization for doing what you're doing at this time, and you certainly have no statutory. I don't see you have any authority to be here, Fresh Hour interjected, and I would request to see the original of the order signed. You have a certified copy, certified by the clerk. I just handed it to you. I might add there is a representative from the Attorney General's office sitting in this room, and he's been sitting in this room all along, Gilroy said. Fresh Hour, caught somewhat by surprise, and asked to see McCloskey's credentials, and then requested to speak off the record with all parties, including Berkowitz, who had witnessed the heated exchange with detached interest. At the conclusion of the discussion, Fresh Hour, over Felix's strong objection, terminated the interview, but didn't confiscate the Berkowitz statements. He said he was called to Marcy at the request of Dr. Ewa, who thought Berkowitz was being interrogated for too long a period. It was my opinion that Ewa tried to stop Berkowitz at the lunch break and thought he had. But when Berkowitz remained in the interview during the afternoon, he took steps, but whoever it was, Berkowitz said, tried to poison his mind about our intentions and apparently wasn't concerned with Berkowitz's stamina. Gilroy then asked Ewa, were you present at any time during the questioning of Mr. Berkowitz? Do I have the answer to this question? Ewa asked Fresh Hour. Yes. No, I wasn't, Ewa replied. Outside, both Gilroy and I exploded. First, someone tries to shut him up during the lunch period, and then we get cut off cold, and they try to withhold the material, I said. I smell a rather large rat in the woodpile. Screw 'em, Felix said. We've got it all on the record. You know, one of them said we're going too far, that we went far afield, that we were trying to solve the Son of Sam case. God forbid anyone would want to solve the Son of Sam case, I answered. Although I'd flown up to Utica, I drove back to Westchester with Felix and Lorraine. On the long trip, we went over the day's events. Lorraine played a tape of the interview, which she'd made as a backup for her court steno notes. He did contradict himself, I said. He gave it up, then took it back, and then gave it up again. I think we all know where the truth is, Felix replied. You and I both knew when he was caught and tried to back away, but he kept coming back to the truth. I truly believe he wanted to give it all up. We didn't break for lunch. I think we could have broken him. If we didn't break for lunch, I think we could have broken him. We then analyzed where the investigation stood. Berkowitz's confirmation of the word association code in the Breslin letters strongly indicated, as I'd felt all along, that he hadn't written that communication, at least not alone. John Carr, though dead, was almost certainly an accomplice, and Michael Carr also emerged as a top candidate. And then there was Fred Cowan, about whom we could do little at the present. What about the cult, Felix suggested? That's supposed to be the allusions in the letters, and the dead dogs, and the existence of a conspiracy. If that were more than two if there were more than two in this, we're approaching a cult by definition, and the other indications tell us what kind of cult it was. Satanic, I observed. You noticed he didn't even try to deny the Black Mass referenced in the Breslin letter. What do you think he meant when he said he was protecting what he took to be hundreds of people? Felix asked. I didn't know if that was a BS statement or not. If he was leveling with us, it means that our neighborhood cult has branches in other places. I've got some ideas, but it's going to take a lot more work to firm them up. But first, we've got to try to pinpoint the group's location in Westchester. That's the most important thing to do. The real significance of Marcy went beyond what we perceived at the time. It would be almost 1 year to the day later when its true import would emerge. Back in Westchester, I approached my neighbor Tom Bartley. I couldn't tell him exactly what happened at Marcy because of court restrictions, which in fact resulted in the interrogation's specifics being kept under wraps until this writing. But I was able to tell Bartley enough had been learned to warrant a strong pursuit of the case. Tom was interested, and we looked for a way to bring the Son of Sam case into the headlines again. I knew what that way would be, and it would be in a legitimate, newsworthy manner. It was time to hold the Westchester Sheriff's Department and the Yonkers Police accountable for some of their actions in the county. Actions which enabled Berkowitz at least to remain at large for 2 months and 4 shootings longer than he would have been had the most basic investigative procedures been followed. Berkowitz had been sending a message to local authorities before his arrest. As he said at Marcy, well, I wanted the police to come and find me, but they didn't. The Gannett Westchester Rockland chain published a morning paper today which served Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam counties, southern Connecticut, and the North Bronx. The group also printed nearly 10 afternoon dailies in the region. In terms of circulating, the papers reached a considerable number of readers. After several months of further investigation and conferences with Bartley, executive editor Joe Ungaro, and Dave Hartley, editor of the Yonkers Herald-Statesman, plans were formulated to publish a series describing the failure of local authorities in the Berkowitz matter. We were delayed by official stonewalling as both Yonkers PD and the Sheriff's Department sought to keep us from documenting what I already knew to be true. It was public knowledge that volunteer Sheriff's Deputy Craig Glassman received 4 threatening letters upon his upstairs neighbor Berkowitz in the months prior to his apprehension. However, no one except sheriff's officials knew that the first note, penned in early June 1977, contained Berkowitz's most recent former address on the envelope, that of the Casetta home in New Rochelle. Likewise, no one knew that the second letter, dated July 13th, contained a reference to Captain Carr and utilized Command Post 316 as part of the return address. Carr lived at 316 Warburton Avenue. Neither return address was investigated by Sheriff's Department. If they had been, the department would have walked right into the Casetta and Carr letters, Beehive and Berkowitz, through the matching handwriting on all the correspondence and other factors, would have been identified immediately as the person who threatened Glassman's life. He could have been arrested by mid-June, 2 weeks before the Eliphas disco woundings, and 6 weeks before the Moskowitz Violante attack in Brooklyn. The Sheriff's Department was trying to keep a lid on those return addresses, but I found out what they were and recognized the implications. Likewise, the Yonkers police, who were handed Berkowitz's name on June 10th as the suspected writer of the Carr letters and possible shooter of Sam Carr's dog, didn't even question Berkowitz, who also could have been linked to another dog shooting and the fire bombings of the Carr and Nito homes in the Pine Street neighborhood. The Gannett editors, the Gannett editors thought those were stories worth telling, but because of Jim Midigar's legal difficulties, the newspaper staff decided it would be wiser if his name wasn't officially connected to the articles, so Bartley and I shared the byline. The first piece was published on Sunday, February 25th, 1979, and excerpted here. It highlights the discoveries. David Berkowitz could have been jailed on a number of serious charges that would have taken him off the streets 2 months before 4 victims before his capture in August 1977 and the Son of Sam Killer. New information shows that not only private citizens, but Berkowitz himself provided the Yonkers Police Department and Westchester Sheriff's Office with all the leads they would have needed to arrest him by at least mid-June 1977, nearly 2 weeks before the shootings of Judy Placido and Salvatore Lupo, and almost 2 months before the murder of Stacy Moskowitz and blinding of Robert Violante. Indeed, the evidence suggests that Berkowitz was, at the very least, taunting the local police, and perhaps even fashioning a deliberate trail of obvious clues. The trail led directly to Berkowitz. From his spacious 7th-floor studio, Berkowitz says he sallied forth to firebomb neighbors' homes, shoot their dogs, and mail letters threatening their lives. And although the Yonkers police and Westchester sheriff's officers say they investigated these crimes, Berkowitz was not arrested. A Gannett Westchester Rockland newspaper's investigation has found out that if all the evidence had been put together, it could have led to Berkowitz's arrest in a host of state and federal crimes, including arson, attempted murder, reckless endangerment, and threatening lives through the mails. The article also reported that officials had rebuffed all attempts to gain access to information, including a Freedom of Information Act request filed. With this scenario, it is not surprising that both agencies were less than willing to cooperate with the newspaper series. It didn't matter. The truth was published anyways. The series ran in 4 segments, and Yonkers Police Department at first threatened to sue Gannett, but the chain, to its credit, stood fast and the articles appeared unencumbered. The editors had been pleased with the investigative reportage done on the series and agreed to add a 5th part to it, which was published on March 1st under Tom Bartley's and my bylines to the story under the headline, "Berkowitz, Others Could Go to Jail," was a landmark in that its publicity. Berkowitz, Others Could Go to Jail was a landmark in that it publicly raised the conspiracy specter for the first time. The headline was based on a sole comment from Berkowitz's Marcy interview 4 months before, when he said there was a good possibility others could be incarcerated if he talked. The article, which occupied more than a full page, discussed the dead German shepherds, some flaws in the official version of the Moskowitz scene, the varying composite sketches of the killer, an allusion to multiple cars at some 44 crime scenes, and interviewed with Mrs. Florence Larson about the calls she took from someone calling himself David Berkowitz of 35 Pine Street, who was interested in adopting a German Shepherd 2 days before the arrest. Significantly, the story contained an analysis of the authorship of the Son of Sam letters I obtained from renowned handwriting expert Charles Hamilton, who would be the first to expose the Hitler diaries as fraudulent for years later. Hamilton said, "I've studied much of the Berkowitz's writing and many samples of his printing too. The Breslin letter is a masterpiece by comparison. Berkowitz doesn't write like that, he doesn't print like that, and he doesn't think like that. Further, he's incapable of it. Whoever wrote that letter to Breslin is possessed of a high degree of urbanity and wit, is well educated, and is able to make words flow together beautifully. Berkowitz can't do it, and his limited education shows in everything he writes. The police were duped into believing Berkowitz wrote that letter to Breslin, Hamilton continued, and then convinced themselves he did it because they wanted to believe he did. But he didn't. I asked Hamilton about theories which suggested a split personality in Berkowitz might have produced a work superior to his own writing, thinking, and graphics abilities. Hamilton simply said, "No, you cannot assume or become a personality or intelligence that is so much greater than your own. It can't be done." A friend of Berkowitz, who'd known him for years, put it another way in the article. If he had 1,000,000 years and 1,000,000 pieces of paper, he couldn't have done that thing, Breslin's letter. It's just not him at all. If you knew him like I do, you'd know that too. The article received scant media attention, as I had feared, but I was delighted because it represented a major breakthrough in the investigation. The Gannett papers were interested and on board. I got the go-ahead to continue probing the case under their auspices. But the article had another immediate result. With one phone call, I would find the group we'd been looking for, the Son of Sam cult. And that's it for today.